4:07 a.m. Svalbard Archipelago, 78 degrees north latitude. The Barents Sea settlement of Barentsburg, Russia's only active settlement on the Norwegian-administered archipelago, had housed between 400 and 500 Russian citizens since the Soviet era. Sustained by a coal mining operation that had been economically marginal for 3 decades and strategically significant for considerably longer, Norway administered Svalbard under the 1920 Spitsbergen Treaty, which granted all signatory nations, including Russia, the right to conduct commercial activities on the archipelago while Norway maintained sovereignty. The treaty was explicit that Svalbard could not be used for warlike purposes, and that no military installations could be established. The treaty had governed the archipelago's status for 104 years. At 4:07:33 a.m., the Norwegian Coastal Ranger Company's surveillance outpost on the ridge above Barentsburg registered activity that was inconsistent with the mining operation's normal 4 a.m. shift change. The thermal imaging system at the outpost showed 17 vehicles moving from the Barentsburg dockside toward the settlement's eastern perimeter. Vehicles whose thermal profile was inconsistent with the Lada 4x4 and UAZ trucks that the mining operations workers used. The outpost's duty officer recorded the contact at 4:07:41 a.m. and transmitted a preliminary assessment at 4:07:55 a.m. Heavy lift vehicles, probable military configuration, movement toward the eastern ridge position that overlooked the primary approach route to Longyearbyen, the archipelago's main settlement and the location of its only airport. The duty officer was correct about the vehicles. He was also looking at approximately 14% of the total force that had arrived at Barentsburg overnight. The Russian operation, designated in its internal planning documents as Exercise Arctic Presence, a designation that would later be the subject of considerable international legal analysis, had been staged through the civilian supply vessel Norilsk, which had docked at Barentsburg's commercial pier at 11:30 p.m. the previous evening on a scheduled resupply run that the Norwegian Directorate of Polar Affairs had logged as routine commercial activity in accordance with the Spitsbergen Treaty's notification procedures. The Norilsk had delivered, alongside its logged cargo of equipment for the mining operation, approximately 340 GRU Spetsnaz personnel in civilian clothing, 24 wheeled armored vehicles disassembled for compact transport and reassembled in Barentsburg's equipment building overnight, 4 Pantsir S-1 short-range air defense systems in their transport configuration, and pre-positioned communications equipment including a satellite uplink that was compatible with Russian military frequency management architecture. By 4:07 a.m., when the Norwegian outpost registered the first vehicle movement, the force had been in Barentsburg for 6 hours and 19 minutes. The assembly had been completed. The equipment was operational. The Pantsir S-1 systems had been positioned on the high ground flanking the eastern ridge at 3:14 a.m. Their radar systems had been activated at 3:47 a.m. They had been tracking the Norwegian surveillance outpost's thermal imaging system since 3:49 a.m. The outpost's thermal camera had a range of approximately 8 kilometers. The Pantsir systems were within that range and were aware of it. At 4:09 a.m., the Norwegian Coastal Ranger duty officer transmitted his assessment to the Joint Operational Headquarters in Bodø, Norway. At 4:11 a.m., Bodø transmitted to NATO's Combined Air Operations Center at Ramstein, to Césure at Mons, and to the Norwegian Embassy in Washington. At 4:13 a.m., the Norwegian Defense Minister was notified. At 4:15 a.m., the Prime Minister's secure line was activated. Norway had a total of 40 Coastal Ranger personnel on Svalbard, the maximum military presence permitted by the Norwegian interpretation of the Spitsbergen Treaty's warlike purposes prohibition, exercised as a law enforcement function rather than a military one. 40 personnel against a force the preliminary assessment was placing at between 300 and 400. Norway's nearest significant military assets were F-35A fighters at Evans Air Station on the Norwegian mainland. 2 hours of flight time from Longyearbyen under standard approach, or approximately 90 minutes with direct routing. Norwegian frigates were operating in the Norwegian Sea, with the closest at approximately 19 hours transit time to Svalbard at maximum speed, 90 minutes of flight time. 2 hours before the F-35s could reach Svalbard. The force that had arrived in Barentsburg had 6 hours and 19 minutes of head start. At 4:19 a.m., the Russian Foreign Ministry transmitted a formal diplomatic note to the Norwegian government, simultaneously released publicly. The note stated that the Russian Federation had deployed a security element to Barentsburg in response to Norwegian violations of the Spitsbergen Treaty's equal access provisions. Specifically, a Norwegian regulatory decision made 4 months earlier that had imposed environmental restrictions on Russian mining operations in a manner that the Russian Federation assessed as discriminatory and inconsistent with the treaty's commercial access guarantees. The security element, the note stated, was present in a civilian capacity to protect Russian citizens and Russian commercial interests. It was not a military deployment. It did not constitute a warlike purpose under the treaty's Article 9. Russia called on Norway to immediately reverse the discriminatory regulatory decision and to refrain from any action that would complicate the situation. The diplomatic note's characterization of the deployment as civilian was contradicted by the Pantsir S-1 air defense systems that the Norwegian surveillance outpost could now track on its thermal imaging system. Pantsir S-1 is a military system. It is not an instrument of civilian security. Its presence on Svalbard was, under any reading of the Spitsbergen Treaty's prohibition on military installations, a violation of the treaty's fundamental terms. The question that Norway and its allies were processing at 4:19 a.m. was not whether the treaty had been violated. The question was what responding to that violation required, what it permitted, and what it risked. The intelligence picture that had preceded the operation was a study in the limits of collection against a well-disciplined concealment effort. U.S. and Norwegian satellite imagery had tracked the Norilsk's departure from Murmansk on its published commercial schedule and had assessed it as consistent with the monthly resupply pattern it had maintained for the preceding 2 years. The vessel's cargo manifest, submitted to Norwegian customs in accordance with the Spitsbergen Treaty's regulatory framework, had listed equipment and consumables consistent with its historical load. The satellite imagery had not resolved the interior of the vessel's hold. The signal's intelligence collection over the Barentsburg area in the 72 hours before the deployment had not detected the preparation activities because the GRU personnel aboard the Norilsk had maintained complete communications silence. No encrypted transmissions, no mobile device usage, no radio communication of any kind that differed from what a standard civilian crew would generate. The concealment discipline was total and had been maintained for the entire duration of the vessel's 28-hour transit from Murmansk. The Norwegian Directorate of Polar Affairs had received no indication that distinguished the Norilsk's November transit from its October, September, or August transit. The intelligence community's pre-event picture had assessed the Svalbard situation as elevated tension, but below operational threshold for an imminent military action. The assessment had been wrong not because of collection failure in the conventional sense, but because the Russian operation had been designed from inception to be invisible to the specific collection methods that monitored it. The fait accompli was the Russian operation's central strategic mechanism. A force of 340 personnel with air defense coverage, positioned on commanding terrain overlooking Longyearbyen, created a situation that was extremely difficult to reverse without a kinetic operation that would be conducted in the Arctic. Against a hardened defensive position with the risk of escalation against a nuclear power, in defense of a legal principle rather than in response to a direct attack on alliance members. The operation had been designed so that responding to it would appear disproportionate even though the operation itself was a treaty violation. This was the architecture of the fait accompli. make the violation easier to sustain than to reverse. At 4:31 a.m., Saussure transmitted to all NATO member commands a preliminary assessment and a request for available response assets. The assessment identified 3 categories of action: diplomatic, legal, and operational. The diplomatic track was already moving. Norwegian, American, British, and German ambassadors in Moscow had been directed to request urgent meetings with the Russian Foreign Ministry. The legal track was a referral to the Spitsbergen Treaty's dispute resolution mechanism, which in practice meant the International Court of Justice and a timeline measured in years. The operational track was the one the CAOC was being asked to assess. The operational assessment produced 3 options in order of escalation threshold. Option 1. Establish a Norwegian and Allied air presence over Svalbard through continuous combat air patrol, demonstrating that the archipelago's airspace was not controlled by the Pantsir S-1 systems and preserving the option to land forces at Longyearbyen. Option 2. Disable the Pantsir S-1 systems through standoff engagement, removing the Russian forces' air defense coverage without directly engaging the ground personnel. Option 3. A combined arms operation to compel the withdrawal of the Russian force from the eastern ridge positions, returning the situation to the pre-operation status quo. The Pantsir S-1 problem was the operational key that all 3 options had to address. The Pantsir S-1's engagement envelope covered altitudes from 15 meters to 15,000 meters and ranges from 1.2 to 20 kilometers, with an effective engagement probability against fighter-sized targets above 80% within its optimal engagement band. An F-35A approaching Longyearbyen from the south would transit the Pantsir's engagement envelope for approximately 4 minutes during its approach and departure. 4 minutes in a high engagement probability envelope against a system operated by GRU technical personnel was not an acceptable approach risk. The F-35s could not operate freely in Svalbard airspace with the Pantsir systems active. At 4:44 a.m., the Norwegian government formally requested secure authorization for Option 1, the Combat Air Patrol Establishment, as an immediate first step. The authorization was transmitted to Evenes Air Station at 4:46 a.m. 2 F-35s had been at 5-minute alert since 4:20 a.m. in response to Bodo's preliminary alert. They were airborne at 4:51 a.m., 62 minutes after the Norwegian outpost's first contact report. The F-35A's stealth configuration provided a fundamental operational advantage against the Pantsir S-1's radar. The system's L-band target detection radar, which generated the initial track on approaching aircraft, had a significantly reduced detection range against the F-35's low observable design compared to its detection range against a conventional aircraft. At the Pantsir's operational radar power levels, the F-35's radar cross-section in its clean configuration produced a detection range of approximately 40 to 60% of what a conventional fighter would generate. That reduced detection range translated to a compressed engagement timeline that, combined with the F-35's electronic warfare systems, created manageable approach risks rather than unacceptable ones. At 5:14 a.m., the 2 F-35s reached Svalbard airspace from the south at 35,000 feet altitude, transmitting on Norwegian sovereign frequency management protocols that established their position in Norwegian-administered airspace. The Pantsir S-1 systems at Barentsburg acquired the F-35s at 5:17 a.m. at 62 kilometers range. The reduced detection range that the aircraft's design produced in the Pantsir's operational configuration. The Pantsir's engagement range against the F-35 at 35,000 feet was approximately 18 kilometers. The F-35s maintained 45 kilometers separation from the Barentsburg position throughout their transit of the southern Svalbard airspace corridor, remaining outside the Pantsir's effective engagement envelope while demonstrating that Norwegian airspace above the archipelago was being monitored and was not being ceded to the Russian forces' air defense coverage. The Russian force at Barentsburg did not fire. The Pantsir systems remained in tracking mode without transitioning to engagement mode. The Russian operational commander at Barentsburg assessed the F-35 transit as a demonstration rather than a preparatory act for an immediate kinetic response. And assessed, correctly, given the orders the F-35 pilots were operating under, that the aircraft would not enter the Pantsir's engagement envelope without a broader operational authorization that had not yet been issued. The standoff had been established in physical space. 2 Norwegian F-35s in Norwegian airspace. 4 Pantsir systems on Russian-occupied high ground, neither firing, both demonstrating. The 40 Norwegian coastal rangers at Longyearbyen had received updated orders at 4:22 a.m. Maintain defensive positions, do not engage Russian forces unless directly fired upon, and facilitate any civilian evacuation that local authorities deem necessary. The orders were operationally sound and legally careful. The coastal rangers' presence was framed as law enforcement rather than military, and engaging Russian personnel without being fired upon first would have complicated the legal picture that Norway needed to maintain clearly in the diplomatic and potential legal proceedings that were now in motion. The Rangers' commanding officer had made contact with the Russian forces' apparent command element at 4:55 a.m. through a radio frequency that the Russian force was using for local coordination. The contact had been brief. The Russian officer had stated that the security element was present in Barentsburg and its immediate vicinity to protect Russian citizens and had no intent to move into Longyearbyen. The Norwegian officer had stated that the presence of military systems on Svalbard was a violation of the Spitsbergen Treaty and that Norway was demanding immediate withdrawal. The exchange had not produced an agreement. It had produced a direct communication channel between the two forces and a mutual understanding that neither side was preparing to initiate contact in the immediate term. At 5:41 a.m., the diplomatic channel produced its first substantive exchange. The Russian ambassador in Oslo transmitted a message stating that the Russian security element at Barentsburg was prepared to engage in direct dialogue with Norwegian authorities regarding the treaty dispute, and that Russia was prepared to consider adjustments to the security element's posture if Norway committed to reversing the mining regulatory decision that had triggered the deployment. The message was not a withdrawal offer. It was an invitation to negotiate the legal dispute on terms that accepted the Russian forces' presence as a bargaining position rather than a treaty violation to be remedied. Norway's response, transmitted at 5:49 a.m., rejected the framing. Norway's position was that the Russian forces' presence was itself a violation of the Spitsbergen Treaty's prohibition on military installations and warlike purposes, that the regulatory decision regarding mining operations was an internal Norwegian administrative matter not subject to reversal under military pressure, and that Norway was calling on Russia to immediately withdraw its security element from positions outside Barentsburg settlement. Norway simultaneously requested an emergency NATO foreign ministers consultation at 8 a.m. Brussels time, which was 7 a.m. London, 2 a.m. Washington. The request was transmitted within 30 minutes of the response to Moscow. At 6:04 a.m., nearly 2 hours after the Norwegian outpost's first contact report, the operational situation at Svalbard was this: Russian force of approximately 340 personnel with 24 wheeled armored vehicles, and 4 Pantsir S-1 air defense systems on the high ground east of Barentsburg, controlling approaches to Longyearbyen from the east. 2 Norwegian F-35 as in a continuous combat air patrol circuit south of the Pantsir engagement envelope. 40 Norwegian coastal rangers in Longyearbyen, maintaining their positions and monitoring the approach route. No contact between the two ground forces. Russian diplomatic channel open but proposing negotiation rather than withdrawal. Norwegian diplomatic position holding firm on withdrawal as a precondition for any negotiation. NATO emergency consultation requested for 6 hours hence. US, UK, and French ambassadors in Moscow seeking urgent meetings. The CAOC at Ramstein was assessing Option 2, the standoff engagement of the Pantsir systems, as a contingency that would require political authorization at the national command authority level of each participating nation. The assessment identified the AARGM-ER from F-35 standoff range as the technically viable instrument against the Pantsir's radar systems, with a standoff engagement profile that would allow the F-35 to remain outside the Pantsir's engagement envelope throughout the ordnance delivery. The engagement would disable the radar, not the system itself, a proportionate response that removed the air defense coverage without conducting a broader kinetic operation against Russian personnel. The option had been prepared. The authorization had not been requested. The political decision chain for authorizing a standoff ordnance engagement of Russian military systems on Norwegian sovereign territory, even in response to a clear treaty violation, even with a technically proportionate means, was a decision with implications that the NATO consultation process at 8 a.m. Brussels time was designed to process. The fait accompli had placed the alliance in exactly the position it was designed to place it, able to act, calculating whether acting was worth the risk of what came next. While the Russian force held its position and the diplomatic exchanges continued, the F-35's performance in the Svalbard airspace demonstration had resolved one operational question that the Option 2 assessment required as an input: whether the aircraft could approach the Pantsir engagement envelope closely enough to execute a standoff, AARGM-ER engagement without entering the Pantsir's optimal intercept band. The 5:14 a.m. transit data had confirmed that the F-35's radar cross-section reduction provided a detection range of approximately 62 kilometers, and the AARGM-ER's standoff range against a radar emitter exceeded 80 kilometers in its standard employment profile. The geometry was favorable. The F-35 could release the AARGM-ER from outside the Pantsir's detection envelope against the Pantsir's own radar, which would be actively transmitting at the moment of release, and would therefore be providing its own homing signal to the inbound seeker. The Pantsir could not defend against a system it couldn't see launched from an aircraft it hadn't yet detected. The engagement window, if authorized, was operationally clean. The authorization was what remained. Time from first Norwegian contact report to F-35 alert launch: 44 minutes. Time from alert launch to F-35 arrival in Svalbard airspace: 23 minutes. Russian force at Barentsburg, approximately 340 personnel. 4 Pantsir S-1 systems, 24 armored vehicles operational since 11:30 p.m. previous evening. Norwegian ground force at Longyearbyen, 40 coastal rangers, position maintained, no contact with Russian force. Pantsir engagement radius controlled by Russian force, eastern approaches to Longyearbyen including primary airport approach. Norwegian airspace south of Barentsburg, demonstrated and maintained by 2 F-35As as of 5:14 a.m. Diplomatic status: negotiation proposed by Russia, rejected by Norway. NATO emergency consultation requested, ambassadorial contact ongoing. Option 2 standoff engagement, assessed as viable, authorization not yet requested. Treaty status: Spitsbergen Treaty 1920. Article 9 prohibition on warlike purposes assessed as violated, remediation mechanism. Diplomatic and legal timeline indeterminate. The 104-year-old treaty had been designed for a world without Pantsir S-1 systems, without GRU Spetsnaz personnel in civilian clothing, and without the specific operational geometry of a fait accompli conducted through civilian supply vessel logistics. It had been designed with the assumption that the prohibition on military installations would be observed, because its violation would be obvious and its diplomatic consequences would be prohibitive. The prohibition had been violated. It was obvious. The diplomatic consequences were being processed in Brussels, Oslo, Moscow, and Washington simultaneously. The operational consequence was 2 F-35s circling at 35,000 feet and 340 Russian personnel on Norwegian sovereign territory, who had not been asked to leave in any language they were prepared to hear.